Hi, Kerri. Thank you ever so much for agreeing to do the podcast. How would you describe yourself if you were to describe what you do to somebody?
Oh, that's always tricky. Um, I tend to say I'm a signwriter first because people understand what a signwriter is. You know, they have got a picture in their head of someone up a ladder with a paint palette painting the front of a shop sign or something like that. If I say I'm a canal artist, people think I paint watercolours of boats or canal scenes, and so I have to sort of edge into that and say no, I actually paint the boats themselves. It's called Roses and Castles, and I do the sign writing as well. So I have to kind of ease people into what I actually do.
We were talking about the history of what people would think of as canal art, and it is very interesting, isn't it? How there are there are very common themes that seem to follow a lot of canal art. You talk about castles and rivers and mountains, and roses is a big symbol. Can you explain a little bit about the history of canal art?
Um, it's a bit tricky because I would love to tell you exactly who invented it and when. And it was a Tuesday, and his name was Bob. But no one really knows. It kind of evolved, and no one understood the importance of it, so nobody documented it. Um, it evolved in a sort of little bubble of perfect timing. We're talking early industrial revolution. The world's opened up. All of a sudden, people can see things from Russia and even China and Holland and France and Germany. And there was a real melting pot moment of English folk art, which is predominantly flowers, mixing with things like Russian folk art, which was very gothic and moody and castles. And it became very popular. And that started to be reflected on the waterways as well, because the castles that you see, they don't look like Windsor Castle. They're very Eastern European or Bavarian, almost Disneyfied with turrets and, very fairy tale like. So it evolved as a mixture of lots of different things. Even though people see it as very quintessentially English, it really isn't.
And do we know why it manifested itself in on narrowboats?
Yeah, I think it was a mixture of a few things. The narrowboat people, or bargees, some people call them, really were isolated. They were in a little bubble. The general public didn't understand them because they didn't go to school, they didn't go to church, they didn't have a house, they couldn't contemplate the differences between the two. And I think those differences meant that the bargees lived their own life in their own little bubble, and it lasted a lot longer than a lot of folk art did. They'd lost their houses. When the train started to be introduced and work got scarcer, they had to give up their houses and move the whole family onto the boats. They've lost their gardens. They're travelling through really horrible, dirty, smoky industrial quarters with their loads. So, it's understandable that they wanted their boats to be bright and colourful and beautiful. And when they close those doors at night, they see the image of the castle, and that's something to aspire to. They're living in a tiny, 6 foot space with 3, 4, 5 kids screaming, and they've got to be working for something. And maybe, if they work hard enough, they'll be rewarded in heaven with that beautiful castle on their doors. So it was a real mixture of reasons why it developed in that way. We'd got the influence of Russian folk art and things like that, plus losing their houses and wanting to have flowers and brightness. And it became a competition as well between the bargees to have the best boat, the most beautiful, the shiniest brasses, the whitest lace. So it evolved in the perfect little microclimate and survived because they were so separate from the rest of society.
Was this pocket of workers, of people, this community, were they migrant workers, do you think, that traveled from Central Europe to England and worked on the canals? Is that how they ended up on the
Yes and no.
boats?
It's hard to say. We've tried to trace individuals through. And of course, we're talking at a time where a lot of people didn't have birth records,
Mm.
didn't bother getting proper christening records or marriage certificates or anything like that. There is some evidence that when we needed to dig out the canals, a lot of men were already working down the mines and we needed manpower. So just like we do today, we opened up our borders and invited people to come in. We had a lot of Irish people come over to help dig the canals. And we did have some Romany gypsy people coming, working their way through Europe to get to us. And there's a bit of an influence with some of the gypsy brush strokes as well. Again, no one knows for sure. So it was a real melting pot of people. There were a lot of people who couldn't work down the mines who went to work on the boats instead. But it's hard to say if there, I don't think there was a large number of travellers working the canals, but there certainly were some. And that influence of traveller art mixed with folk art as well to go onto the boats. So of course at the time they weren't, if we're talking about travellers, they weren't living in the beautiful bow-top wagons that we associate now with Romanies. That hadn't begun at that stage, but they were painting, they were producing artworks, and we have been able to correlate a few similarities here and there. It's really interesting because no one knows, it's all speculation.
So you think it was a fusion of England or UK-based art or folk art with potentially artwork from Europe mixed together?
Yeah, absolutely. It was the perfect time for it to happen. And there's nothing really that's happened since in the same way. But if you take the Canal Art Rose, for example, you can follow that along the silk route where all the different traders have been, and you can see examples of similar roses all the way through that silk route. You know, and from an English point of view, it goes way back before the War of the Roses. So it's quite fascinating. You could write a whole book just on that, I think.
Do we, talking about the silk route, is there examples of canal art, I call it canal art, on the continent? Do they have, I mean, I assume they have maybe canals and narrowboats. Do they also have something comparable to what we see on narrowboats in this country?
Not to the same extent. There are examples out there, absolutely. And it tends to be associated with travelling art. And there are definitely similarities with some of the scroll work and the roses themselves as well. So we found examples dotted here and there, but because of the nature of people moving around looking for work, it's really hard. It's really difficult to document it, but it is interesting.
I find that there's a lot of similarities between narrowboat art and the artwork you find on carnivals, like carousels and stuff like
Yes,
that.
100%.
There seems to be a lot of
Yeah,
crossover.
absolutely. There is a huge crossover. Fairground art is also an endangered craft, same as canal art, and there are a lot of similarities. I do both. I do a mixture of both. You can probably see I've got some examples behind me of some fairground stuff as well as canal art, and absolutely there is a crossover. Certainly if you look at the scroll work, which is beautiful on the side of the boats, and you'll see that on traditional fairground rides as well.
So when you're designing a piece of art, do you tend to keep to the same sort of themes, or do you ever get commissions for unique styles? Maybe the subject matter isn't roses, but it is in that style, but the content is different. Does that ever happen?
Yeah, I'm very lucky really in that I've got a sort of hardcore group of customers who just want traditional roses and castles, and I'm using the word traditional very loosely.
Yeah.
Because what I paint and is seen as traditional today isn't how canal art was 150 years ago. But I do get customers as well who'll say, this is the thing I want painting. These are colours I like. Do your own thing. And that's wonderful because I can bring in fairground art and I can bring in canal art from 150 years ago, which wasn't just roses. You'd get all kinds of flowers that you could see along the canals that were painted. But over the years, it's been distilled down to roses and castles. So I'm lucky I get to do both.
In terms of the technical challenges of canal art, are there certain images that are harder than others to do?
Ooh, tricky. That's a tricky question because I was lucky. I was apprenticed to a lady called Julie Tonkin. And when you're an apprentice, the way you learn is to do the same thing again and again and again. They say it's 10,000 hours to be an apprentice before you pass. So I don't find things tricky because I've done so much of it. When I teach other people, there are certain things that they find to be quite difficult. And weirdly, it's what I wouldn't even think was tricky at all. There are a lot of daisies in canal art. And for some reason, daisies give people real headaches. But to me, it's a little round ball for the middle and some stick for the pen. I don't understand what the problem is. So it's quite strange that what they find to be difficult.
You talk about working as an apprentice. How did you get into it? So have you always had an artistic, flair?
I was very lucky. I come from a very craft-focused family and background. I'm from Walsall originally, which is the home of leatherwork. So my nan worked in that industry, making saddles and all kinds of things. She was pretty cool, actually. She was quite badass. She made the leather helmets for the land speed record. How cool is that? So cool. Very cool. So she taught me a lot of things of making something with my hands, and we were always making something and crafting. And my dad was the same. He was always taking things apart and sometimes getting them back together again. And he was a draftsman, so he had an eye for detail. And he introduced me into, pen and wash work and line work, and very intricate stuff. And I think that's where my love of signwriting came from, because that's very precise, whereas canal art is very free-flowing. So it's a mixture of the two. So my background of craft in the family sort of drew me towards canal art, really. And I went along to one of Julie Tonkin's courses, and she tapped me on the shoulder at the end of the day and said, come back tomorrow. And my apprenticeship started the next day. I was very lucky.
Did she spot something?
She must have done, but I'll tell the truth. I've got the first thing I ever painted with her. It's a little cabin stool, and I keep it deliberately because it's terrible. It's really terrible, and I keep it now so that every now and again I look at it and think, "Oh, blimey, yeah." But she obviously must have seen something. I don't know.
Is it still as popular as ever in terms of demand?
I get asked this a lot, actually, especially by younger people who are thinking of going into it as a living. And what I say to them is, you cannot make a living purely out of canal art. You can't walk into it as a job and suddenly pay all of your bills. It's a very strange world. That bubble I mentioned before, that bubble still exists of people will employ me because they've heard from so-and-so that I've done a good job. And it takes time to build that kind of reputation up. I'm lucky in that that's happened for me. It's not as popular as it was. We went through a dip of people wanting very sleek, modern, shiny, chrome-covered boats. We call them IKEA boats, which are beautiful. I'd love a nice, clean IKEA boat that has got no dust or dog hair or anything on it. But it is starting to make a resurgence. And I think programs like The Repair Shop and Touring Tool Shed have really started to get people interested in traditional handcrafts, not just painting, all kinds of things. And there is a resurgence now of that coming back again.
Have you got what's your most unusual request in terms of someone's asked you to do something? What sticks in your mind?
Ooh, that's tricky. I've done fairground horses where they want specific things on, like parrots or something like that, and that makes me have to stop and think. I'm like, a parrot? Okay, can I paint a parrot? Of course I can. But the one that really sticks in my mind wasn't that it was unusual. It's just that it was one of those jobs where we had to keep saying to the customer, "Are you sure? Are you really sure?" And it was a boat called Pilgrim. And beautiful boat, lovely boat with a lovely, great big Lister engine that was very shiny. And he obviously loved this engine, and it was beautiful. And in the engine room, there were lots of panels all the way around, floor to ceiling. And he wanted a group of roses on every single panel. And that's a lot of roses. And me and Julie got together because there were so many roses, and we did it as a tag team. And at the end of that week, we hated roses. We hated roses with a passion because they were everywhere. We did something like, I'm trying to remember, something like 240 odd roses in this one little space. And he loved it. He absolutely loved it. But we walked away going, bloody roses. I hate roses. So that one sticks in my mind of are you sure? You're really sure?
Do they ever tell you why they want these things the way they do? Or do you not ask? Is it just more trouble than it's worth?
No, sometimes you get some lovely stories from customers. I'm working with a lady at the moment who has got a tugboat, and it's a real personal connection for this lady because it's named after a boat that her dad used to sail on. And it's, if a boater invites you onto their boat, it's quite a special thing because it's their home. You know, you can't assume that you can just walk in. She invited me in and showed me a picture of her dad and her mom. Her mom was absolutely a stunner, and this boat that it was named after. And I got the whole story then of how their mom and dad met and why it's special and how she wants to keep that memory going and keep the name going. And, you know, we probably chatted for a good hour or so, and it just gave me an idea of what she was after. And it helped me get a design into my head of what she wanted for the final piece, which we'll be painting in the next month or so when the weather calms down. So talking to people and getting their stories of why they're asking for that thing. I've got one behind me. There's a little cabin stall for a boat called Fanny Summers. There's no way I was not going to ask for that commission. Yes, I will paint that. Come on. That is just funny. So you do get some weird and wonderful names as well. It's always amusing.
So it's not just narrow boats then, it's all different types of boats that
all different types of boats. I get a lot of interest from working boats, you know, the traditional wooden boats, or boats that have got some age to them that want something painting from that period, which is absolutely great. And that's more like conservation work for me of keeping that style going. But you do get boats straight out of the boat dock that are brand spanking new, and they want something a bit, you know, weird and wonderful on it. The trickiest thing I had to paint was the cross of St Chad. Had to Google who St Chad was. No clue. Some dude from Lichfield. And it got a really complex shield arrangement with lots and lots of crosses. And it was one of those jobs where you go, oh no, okay, yeah, I can do that. It's fine. Yeah, but that took a very steady hand. So you get all sorts of things.
If somebody was interested in getting into this profession, what would you advise them? I mean, what things surprised you? What things would you look back and wished you could change or do differently?
That's a really, really good question. I wish I hadn't taken things to heart so much. Canal art, not talking about signwriting now or fairground art, just canal art has got a lot of very knowledgeable, very experienced people who have been doing it for years and years, and they're all really, really well known. And I was quite sort of tender-hearted with some of these people. I looked up to them like gods, and they'd say something and I'd crumble and think, oh my God, I've ruined it all. It's terrible. I'm never going to be a canal artist. They don't like me, blah, 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 blah. When actually, no, I don't really give a stuff. I teach the traditional way. I pass on the history as best that I know it, with the caveat that no one really knows. I encourage people to do their own thing as well, because if we try and be too strict, and if we try and ring fence canal art too much, it's going to die, because you won't be able to make a living from it. People will stop asking to be taught it, and it'll become a hobby thing and a quaint thing that you occasionally see in a museum. So what I've learned is to be a bit more relaxed. And yes, it's very important to do the traditional stuff and to know the history and to pay dues to that and to put the hours in to recreate it. Absolutely. And I go into schools to teach these things as well. But you've got to be flexible. You've got to make it viable for today. And that was something that I didn't realise for a good few years. And I was sort of beating myself up thinking, why am I getting nowhere? And it's because I was purely concentrating on the traditional stuff. And you can't do that in today's day and age. You have to be flexible.
Yeah. I think that's right, isn't it? Staying relevant. You know,
Yeah,
it's important to keep a nod to the past and acknowledge, and yeah, that's what some people like, but also a lot of people are looking for new styles maybe to kind of work with their current lifestyle or
exactly.
situation.
And not everyone wants roses and castles.
Yeah.
When I teach, I tend to teach a lot more roses courses because people like it more than castles.
Mm.
And in 20 years' time, that trend might change back again. But if I rigidly stuck to the traditional stuff, then I wouldn't be able to make a living. There's no way.
If somebody wants to get into canal art or narrowboat art or any sort of art, what's
Mhm.
their best next step if they're interested in pursuing a career or a hobby?
Okay. Well, there are quite a few of us who are teaching. Um, Up and down the country, the Heritage Craft Association did a survey last year. I don't know how they worked it out, but apparently there's about 20 of us actively painting boats. So we're classed as endangered now. So part of what we need to do as endangered crafters is spread the word. And we do that through teaching. So I run workshops, and there's quite a few other artists up and down the country who do that as well. But I also go into charities and museums and schools to spread the word that way as well, and to try and find people who are interested to take it forward. So there's loads of courses available. You've just got to find them somewhere near you.
I suppose we're lucky because we're central England based. There's a lot of
Mm.
narrowboats, there's a lot of
A
canals.
lot of narrowboats, a lot of canals.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Kerri. It's been great
that's
talking to
okay.
you. Good luck with everything. I'm glad you're over your cold. I know I've had a stinking one myself.
Oh, mate. No, I was barking like a Rottweiler for about 3 weeks, so I feel a lot better now.
Take care, Kerri. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.
Bye bye.